Hello, everyone. This is Professor Hunter, and today I want to talk to you about buying and selling processes. So this builds on the previous material that we've talked about in terms of like sales strategies. So what I'm going to do today is give you more depth to that overall perspective of sales strategies, in particular focusing on the process, the sales process itself in terms of how that works. And you'll see that the process is interactive with the other three components that we talked about that form a sales strategy. So this is on buying and selling processes, and this is kind of the objectives that I hope to talk about. As I mentioned, process first, defining a process. I want to talk some about what's a philosophy and how does a sales philosophy affect the sales process. Then I want to talk as well about how the buying and selling processes can be aligned. That's essentially what you're trying to do. You're often kind of trying to lay out what's the buyer's journey and then overlay your sales activities onto that buyer's journey to develop the sales activities that you want to pursue. I want to talk about the difference between B2C and B2B again, because a lot of what we're going to talk about in the class will focus primarily on B2B buying experiences and understanding those. But of course, much of this applies to B2C. It's just the contexts are quite a bit different when you're selling to consumers versus selling to businesses. And again, as I mentioned earlier, most of your jobs are likely to be in the business-to-business sector. Okay, I want to talk more about the complexity that's associated with like multiple players performing different roles in B2B procurement processes. So there's not always one person that's the buyer. It's typically not a dyadic. Sometimes it can be more dyadic, but it's typically more multiple people representing the buying and the selling organization. That's been an evolution in the way sales has worked that occurred quite a while ago. So I want to outline some of the steps that are associated with how would you map your sales process. And then I want to talk some about the importance of relationships. So that's a second of the major process ones. But we'll actually talk about all four of them somewhat, because one of the concepts I want to introduce today is the idea that the four components are interactive. That means if you change one, it affects the other, and they're interdependent. So they have to kind of work together. Changing something about the process may mean that you need different people to accomplish that, or it may mean that you need different technologies to accomplish what you're trying to do. And if you set a different relationship strategy, that may affect the other three variables as well. So that's the idea of interdependence amongst those four components and interactivity. So that's one of the key concepts I want you to pick up on in terms of big picture stuff today. Okay, so this goes back to the original slide, and hopefully you've thought some about this because this is from the previous lecture on integrating marketing and sales strategies. So what you should have seen from that is that you take the marketing strategy is definitely going to have some effect on the sales strategy, but this is the framework that gives you the big picture idea of how you think about multiple things when you're trying to form the sales strategy. And as you recall, the sales strategy is about looking at a target market, a target persona. We'll talk some about that, right? And then when you're thinking about that target market or target persona, how do you create value for that target persona? So one of the things that I'm going to talk primarily about in the class, because it's just contemporary selling, is that you're not often creating value in isolation. In the relationships that are characteristic of B2B selling today, you're co-creating value. So you're working with the buyer or the buying organization to develop solutions that work for both the buying organization and the selling organization. So that, again, is kind of the overview, the overarching way of thinking about kind of where we're going into it. And then all these different things that are like customers, competitors, company, collaborators, context, those things have an effect on the sales strategy. And they basically, that's going to have an effect, like the way you change the elements of the marketing mix will also kind of have effects on your strategy. So the salesperson is kind of definitely the focus of the class, and how do you manage that salesperson is really kind of the essence of sales management. So salespeople are always an important component of what we're talking about, but sometimes we're focused on some of these other three components as well. Okay, so these are the four components. As a reminder, this is these four components: process, relationship, people, and technology form the four components that we're primarily focused on. And those four components were basically shown in that previous slide. It's this ring, right? So you have that Salesforce strategy ring, and that's basically what we're talking about when we're kind of talking about the four working together as a Salesforce strategy. So this interactive and interdependent means that, again, as I said earlier, change one that affects the other. So if you think about that as kind of these four-way cross that I put in the middle of that, you can see kind of the idea. That's trying to convey the interactive and interdependence of all of these different components. And it's not just kind of straight across. So process can affects relationship, and process affects people, and process affects technology. So all these things sort of interact. So that symbology is trying to get at that idea of the interactivity and interdependence between the four components. Okay, so I want to back up for a second and talk about sales philosophies, or methodologies, as they're sometimes called, and then how those sales philosophies or methodologies influence process. So if you're thinking about it from that big picture slide from before, what I'm talking about are things that are associated with the company or the context that have an effect on Salesforce strategy. So philosophies are kind of part of that. A philosophy may evolve from like the company's objectives or the company's history or the company's mission, and that becomes kind of what drives, this is the way we think about our company and the way we're going to interact with our customers. It can be driven by context, right? Because, you know, if you're in a scenario in which different ways of selling are just somewhat considered the industry norms, for example, the context may drive the type of philosophy that you have, and that philosophy could be one that's trying to differentiate from the norms, or it could be one that's trying to coexist or conform to the norms. So you have a lot of different choices as sales managers or as sales organizations in forming your processes. But philosophy is one of the things that I want to highlight here. And philosophy is basically this idea, this is your way of thinking about the world, you know, your worldview, so to speak, right? Of, you know, which is in your worldview from a sales perspective is going to be the sales organization, your target market organizations, and the broader context that impacts your sales strategy. So philosophy is this way of thinking, as you've always heard the term used in the past. A process is different in the sense that a sales process is basically the set of steps that are associated with taking a customer from the initial interactions to the gaining commitment or closing. So often those initial interactions in a sales call are referred to as the openings, and then the closing is kind of at the end. So sales is often simplified, and you've seen that it's often overly simplified into the notion that you're going to go from opening a relationship to closing that relationship all in one sitting. You know, one call, one stop sales call in which you go from having never met the customer to closing the customer and getting them to buy like millions of dollars worth of stuff. Well, that's not typically how it works. In fact, some people will say it takes as many as 60, 65 different calls to get from like the initial interactions to a major relationship. And once that relationship is established, then that becomes kind of a different type of a sales call. So you're building on the prior relationship, and you're working more as partners with your customers. So there's a lot of business-to-business stuff that doesn't involve sales, doesn't involve like cold calling. It involves kind of working with an established relationship. So if you're working in like really mature industries, for example, I work for Procter & Gamble. So in working for Procter & Gamble, it's not like there's a new grocery retailer that shows up every day. They're few and far between, and they have to be quite significant, frankly, before Procter & Gamble would dedicate sales resources to serving those customers. So that's kind of the reality. Is a lot of selling is going to be what we'll call later farming, which farming is kind of, you know, working with an existing account, as opposed to hunting, which is where you're kind of creating new business. So this notion of hunting and farming is something that I'll talk about a little bit more later as well. But thinking about how philosophies, your sales philosophy, your worldview affects like these processes is what I'm trying to get at here. So I want to talk a little bit about some different sales philosophies so you get an idea of what sales philosophies are. Okay. So sales process, but you know, as I mentioned earlier, is really that clearly defined set of steps that are associated with it. And these processes, of course, are one of the four cornerstones. But as I mentioned, if we back up to the notion of philosophies, I want to talk some about philosophies and how they have an effect. So the first of these philosophies is spin selling. So spin selling is, and I'm going to talk about each one of these in a little bit more, but this slide is just to give you a quick introduction of different philosophies, because they have different components to them that you can kind of pull out and use as part of your other sales process. So it's not like you do one of these but not the others. But the philosophy can have some different impact on the way you sell. So spin selling, in my mind, is one of the foremost ways of thinking about what are the right questions to ask to co-create solutions. Consultative selling is going to focus primarily on this idea of you've got to develop yourself as a trusted advisor or an educator to the customer. And I'll talk again about kind of how that flow would work or that philosophy would work. System savvy selling is really a build on consultative or solution selling, in which instead of focusing just on a mechanistic type of solution, steps, sequences, algorithmic thinking, that sort of thing, it thinks more holistically about the problems and trying to develop solutions to those problems. Inbound selling then is really kind of this idea that's from HubSpot. And inbound selling's real effect is that inbound selling works more through like being found by customers. So the idea is that instead of going out and doing interruptive marketing, which is like advertising, those kind of things where people are watching football and they see an ad and it interrupts what they're doing, that's called interruption. That's traditional marketing. Much of the world of marketing has been dominated by inbound marketing, and inbound selling is kind of a corollary to inbound marketing. And in inbound marketing, the idea is to put the right content on the web so that customers find you, and basically in finding you, that makes them more interested in talking to you about a sales presentation or what you're doing, and then that will help them to kind of develop things that are related to that. That basically will help you to get customers who are more interested in your products. And it basically kind of improves the quality of the starting point for prospects that you would sell to. Okay, customer business development then is going to be is going to focus primarily on co-creating mutual value. So this is kind of the focus of the course. And this is, as you can see, this is kind of the fallback of what I often think about when I think about sales philosophy. So this is probably the dominant philosophy that I use, although all of these other perspectives also inform my perspectives on sales philosophies. Okay, so I'm going to talk about spin selling. So these next few slides give you some background if you want to know more about some of these philosophies. I'm not going to cover a ton of them in the class, but you may be exposed to them when you're out interviewing or looking for jobs or thinking about different companies or developing your own process. So this is really kind of what's a flow chart that gets into what spin selling is. And spin is really an acronym. So as I talked earlier, it talks about different types of questions. But spins suggests that you ask 4 different types of questions. The first one is situation questions, which is getting into kind of what's the situation the buyer is in. The second is problem questions. So what types of problems is the buyer confronting? The third one is actually you're trying to build on those problems that the buyer reveals and develop like what are some of the implications of those problems so that the buyer can understand how complicated those are. And then the fourth type of question are really these needs payoff. Those are really value questions, so that's central to kind of what we're talking about. These are questions about to help the buyer to realize the type of value they might receive from the solution that you're proposing. So spin selling really could be spiv selling, spin selling. The end, if you think of value, that's kind of what it leads to. That's the idea of where you're trying to get in terms of spin selling. Very popular, probably the most popular business-to-business selling approach or philosophy that is out there. So there's a good chance you'll see this one later in life. Okay, so it's been around since the mid-'80s, developed by Neil Rackham, so it's very popular that's out there. And it really is trying to get at this idea of you're trying to use these questions, particularly in the heart of this, trying to go from these problem questions to uncover these implicit needs that the buyer has. So you're trying to kind of drill down into that. Okay, this is a graphic, just a simple graphic of solution selling or consultative selling. So in the idea of consultative selling, you meet the customer, you listen to them, that's the starting point. Instead of communicating, you're listening, trying to understand what the customer situation is. You're studying and analyzing what their pain points are. What is it that's really kind of creating challenges for the customer where you might have solutions. And then you actually are trying to develop yourself as a trusted advisor, and you become more of an educator. So you're trying to teach the customer about how what their problems are and how your solutions can help with that. So you're going to suggest those relevant, pertinent solutions, and then you close the deal, which is basically close the deal means you gain a commitment from the customer. This is the hardest part of professional selling, where you actually ask for the sale. Okay, so that's consultative. Building on consultative system is the idea of system savvy selling. So system savvy selling builds on solution selling or consultative selling. If you're thinking about those types of solutions that you're developing, you can think very algorithmically or you can think very holistically, right? Algorithmic is like very mechanistic. mechanistic way of thinking, where you say step A, B, C, D, E, F, and that becomes like you're looking more at the details of the parts or the trees. You're literally thinking about the trees. Holistic is trying to back up and see the forest, like what are the longer term ramifications of the solutions that you're proposing? Is this idea that the customer is talking about, is that problem going to lead to other problems if you just kind of address the solution for that one problem? How do I think more systemically or holistically about the problems confronting the customer, and develop and propose system savvy selling is just that you propose solutions that work for that. Okay, I'm going to talk, as I said earlier, I would talk a little bit about each one of these somewhat. Okay, so for inbound selling methodology, these are the steps that HubSpot advocates. So this is basically the idea that you're going from these prospects who would be strangers to the firm. So this is from the selling firm's perspective. They're basically strangers, and you're trying to kind of go from those strangers to making them customers. That's kind of the objective of a lot of these different things. So how do you kind of go through that process? Well, a big part of that is like identifying customers, connecting with those customers, exploring those customers, and advising those as they go through these different awareness, consideration, decision stages. So that bottom part is kind of like the buyer's journey. And then the top part are kind of like the steps or the stages of the sales process that they would advocate. So when you get into a lot of this, a lot of times the process we'll talk about is you're often trying to think about what's the buyer's journey, awareness, consideration, decision, and then how do I map on different stages of the sales process to get that. So the stages here might be from identify, connect, explore, advise. And then these intermediate ideas are that you're moving the customer in that sense, and your role as a salesperson changes along the way. Well, the real beauty of inbound selling is that you start with better prospects. So in the traditional world of selling, prospects are those people who are kind of these strangers, right? So if I could actually have better quality leads, and you'll see this has always been kind of sort of the focus on sales, is how do we get better leads? How do we get better strangers? How do we get better information? Well, these strangers find you. So in the HubSpot world or in the inbound marketing world, what you're trying to do is be found. And you're found basically when people do Google searches and find out information from you from the content that you posted about your product or about your services from the internet. So basically when they come in as leads, they're coming in primarily through an inbound. What you're trying to do is get them through an inbound methodology so that they find you. So they're already kind of open to talking to you about your product and stuff like that. And it's not just some random interruption-based marketing. That's what HubSpot would call the traditional marketing, where you're just, what strikes people as more being spammed in the modern world, to actually getting kind of leads that basically getting better quality leads because they're reaching out to you through the content that you posted about the products and the solution that you offer. So that's the idea of inbound selling methodology. Then I want to talk a little bit about the customer business development process. So customer business development is basically kind of focused on how do you add value by building your customer's business. So if you're thinking about your customer's business from the onset, and you're trying to say, okay, what we need to do is we need to find solutions, or I need to propose solutions that will help my customer to build their business. And in building their business, I'm trying to build their business, of course, primarily with my products or my services, right? So how can I use my products and my service to build their business? So that makes it good for both of us. So we're basically kind of seeking this idea of pursuing mutually beneficial interest. So 6 of these different tasks, if we pursue those interests, we'll forge the relationship. And so I refer to those as relationship forging tasks. And so this graphic is trying to give you, well, what are some of those relationship forging tasks that you need to accomplish? So working effectively with others, establishing equitable goal congruence so we can find out a good way of meshing our goals together, using data-driven sales planning, so much more doing sort of preparation and doing my homework before I'm working to try to develop solutions with the customer. Sharing market knowledge, by leveraging the sales analytics, taking those analytics, my understanding of what I know and I know about the solutions and how those solutions will play out over time. And I've got to share that knowledge. But, in my mind, a lot of people talk about developing knowledge or having knowledge for a salesperson. But it's not any good until you share that knowledge. So sharing your knowledge is an important prospect of that. Proposing integrated solutions. So when you propose solutions, you're thinking about both sides of the equation, the buyer and the seller, and you want to propose those. And then coordinating internal resources is where you're going back to your own firm and you're often trying to do things within your firm. This is people in the sales, strategic account management world or key account management world talk about this as internal selling. So you have to go back and coordinate the internal resources to help your customer develop their solutions. So that's kind of the gist of some of the tasks, some of the major tasks that are involved in customer business development, where you're trying to kind of build the customer's business and your business simultaneously, seeking basically the mutual interest of both firms. That's the philosophy of customer business development. So those are some philosophies about sales philosophies that will impact the different sales processes that you adapt. But I wanted to kind of review some of those to give you this bigger 30,000 foot picture of what are sales philosophies and how do those impact sales processes. Turning now to the stages of the selling process. So if you went to your textbook, it talks about these different stages. And those stages are similar in the sense of, you're starting down here with these prospecting for customers, as I mentioned earlier, and you're trying to get all the way to closing the sale. But then, of course, like what your text is emphasizing here, is that you also service the account. So there's a post-sales service relationship. There's still things that you have to do with the account. This is going to vary in different industries in terms of like what's that service obligation. But this would be particularly true if you're selling like high-tech equipment, for Xerox or something like that. Then there's some servicing the account that's associated with it. The nature of that servicing the account might be very different from like the selling account. So who does these different roles can kind of vary from company to company as well. So this is the servicing the account can be a sales role, or it may not be a sales role. That could be totally handed off. So part of what you're going to think about a lot of times when you're thinking about sales processes and sales activities is who does what when in the organization. And is that better to be the salesperson that's doing it, or is it better to have someone else who does that? This all goes back to the notion of division and specialization of labor. So that's Adam Smith's work from over a century and a half ago. So a lot of that's quite a ways back. But thinking about things from that perspective can be useful even in modern era. Okay, so a generic relational sales process. This is looking at how that might look. You initiate these customer relationships. From those customer relationships, once they're initiated, you develop those customer relationships, and then you enhance those relationships. So if I'm looking deeper into kind of the gist of what you're doing with the relationships with customers, these three things are kind of what you're trying to do: initiate, develop, and enhance. So you can see how that's adding some depth to that original slide and one of the four components in terms of relationship. The process, though, the actual steps or the activities of the process are going to be things like this: discovery, planning, market and sales analysis, developing win-win solutions. All that part is kind of part of the initiating. Then you're going to do some of these things, maybe part of how do you develop the customer relationship. And again, I'm talking about this is where negotiations and value co-creation and sales interaction, those kind of things are going to be helpful in the development stage. And then enhancing them are things like follow-through, adding value, preventive care, teamwork, continuing those relationships, and kind of cycling back through in terms of like as you work through your relationship and go through multiple sales calls. Okay, so that's a generic sales process. What I'm going to say is there's no the THE sales process. So I'm trying to say, you'll hear a lot of people say the sales process. What is the sales process? Well, that misses the whole idea of what you're supposed to do with the sales process as a sales manager. You're supposed to tailor the process to the customer. So you want to think about how do you kind of develop a sales process that fits with your business customer account. So we're going to talk about that. And as you get into the HubSpot Academy work, that if you do that, they have a great training program on the Salesforce management, and that training program will help you. It will really focus a lot on process and how do you develop a sales process. Okay, so this is the idea, from the Sales Enablement book. One idea that I want you to take out of that from Bray and Sori is this idea that sales processes you can be too much or too little is a bad thing. That is, if you don't have enough of a sales process, that can be bad. That's not going to optimize the impact. If you have too much, that can be bad. So sales processes can be constraining, but what you want them to do basically is to be guiding. You don't want them to become overcoming, so that some salesperson is just trying to do these mechanical steps and can't think, for example, in the system savvy way, can't think holistically about solutions. So this is the idea of, you want to think about how do you develop a sales process that fits with your business customer account. So we're going to talk about that. And as you get into the HubSpot Academy work, that training program will help you. It will really focus a lot on process and how do you develop a sales process. Okay, so this is the idea of too much or too little is a bad thing. That's from Bray and Sori, and you kind of see that curve. So if you're thinking about that from the amount of the sales process to none to lots, and as you kind of move across that line, you can see the impact varies based on how much detail you have in the sales process. So you're trying to kind of find just the right balance in developing a sales process that doesn't too much or too little. Okay, so this slide is somewhat of a busy slide, but this is the slide that kind of outlines a lot of what I'm going to talk about in terms of sales processes, but I want to give you some preview of where we're going with this. So you're going to start by understanding the buyer's journey. You're going to go from that buyer's journey into actually developing the steps of the sales process. We'll talk some about the notion of target personas. So you're trying to say, okay, how do I develop a persona? And then we're going to do some of these things like thinking holistically, identifying, where the sales rep can help in that buyer's journey, and then figuring out how does the sales rep kind of exit, and earn commitment, how do they kind of get out at each stage. And then beyond kind of those steps that are in the sales process, you want to kind of use a CRM system. So customer relationship management system is a technology system that tracks a lot of the data and the information about the account that's going on. And that's kind of the organization's storage of information that helps to guide them on what they're going to do down the road. And HubSpot will talk a lot about this, but as HubSpot will say, this should be the source of truth, that's within the firm. So you're trying to get all that information in. There's a real trade-off that often comes with CRM systems. Salespeople don't like to use them a lot of times because they feel like they're giving up too much information to management. Management uses those sometimes to monitor or enforce policies, and so sometimes salespeople feel like it's Big Brother looking in on their process, so they're sometimes reluctant to it. So you have to, even as a sales manager, you've got to become a trusted manager with your salespeople so that they'll function in a more productive and functional way that makes your company better. And then you're always going back. This is the notion of continuous improvement. You're always kind of going back and evaluating the sales process and seeking improvements down the road. Okay, so the buyer's journey, I want to stop at this point and say this can be really oversimplified. So this is very active, and the reason I say it can be oversimplified is that people often like to think about a sales process as being this one-step call. It's a gross oversimplification to think that you're going to go from initiating the relationship to closing the sale. And a lot of our competitions, for example, and academics centers on this one-call close thing, and it's they're so rare in business-to-business selling. It's not even, the process is often thought of as multiple steps. And if you were taking spin selling as a process, one of the other major things I like out of spin selling is the idea that you're trying to seek a continuation, to get the basically to move the process along. You're trying to kind of get that to move along, to the next step. So you already know there's going to be different steps that come up as you get there. So I'm going to talk a little bit about B2B procurement processes. And what you're going to see is that procurement processes can be very complicated on the business-to-business side. Okay, so on the B2C side, this is stuff that you already know. On the B2C side, you have buyers who are going through these different steps and stages that you've talked about in marketing. So you should probably know, you've probably been exposed to these kind of things. You've got some problem recognition stage that creates some information search, and they're trying to find internal and external sources. They're evaluating the different alternatives that are out there. After they evaluate those alternatives, they're going to make some kind of purchase decision, and then the purchase decision,
Welcome to slide 21 of the Fab 50. I am Mika Nelson, and I will be your guide through the stages of the customer buying behavior process. Slide 21 is part of the series on Know Your Customer. The customer is one of the 5 C's used in the market opportunity analysis. Slide 19 and 20 of the Know Your Customer series touched on the stimulus response model and Maslow's hierarchy of needs. Slide 21 builds on these topics as marketing attempts to satisfy the customer's needs through a value proposition, and is concluded with slide 22 with a summary of the decision-making sets. Let's start with the 5 steps of the typical customer's buying process. Our process starts with the customer recognizing that they have a need. Next, the customer searches for information on what is available to satisfy the need. Once alternatives are identified, then they are evaluated to try to make the best decision. With the decision made, the customer makes a purchase. Finally, the customer decides that they are either satisfied with the decision or not. Let's take the needs that is described in Maslow's hierarchy. I'm hungry and there's a Chick-fil-A coming into view. I'm going to stop and get something to eat. Some needs are the result of a change in condition. The microwave is broken and cannot be fixed, so I need to replace it. The need may also come from stimuli that creates a want. The new Star Wars movie has a new lightsaber that my son must add to his collection. When it was time to buy a new car, this is the commercial that sealed the deal for me as I navigated I-85 southbound every day at 5 o'clock in the evening.
Lived. We lived, thanks to our Subaru. Love, it's what makes a Subaru a Subaru.
Next comes the search for information. Let's take the case of a car purchase. There are lots of characteristics to consider when purchasing a car. During this stage, the customer is learning and listing all of the things that are important from their perspective, a perspective that you as a marketing professional must know. Depending on what is important, the sorting of the information into must-haves, would-likes, and don't-likes criteria begins. This is the step that organizes all the information, the points of differentiation and compromise. The level of detail of this part of the process depends on the involvement level of the customer. The purpose is to reduce the list until the decision can be made. The topic of decision sets will be discussed in detail in slide 22. The criteria for moving along this part of the process is highly personalized because it depends solely on what is important to the individual customer. With all of the factors weighed, a decision is made, and the customer is ready to complete the purchase. Then comes the disruptors. Some decisions fall victim to analysis paralysis with too many choices that disrupts the purchasing process, or the car you selected with all the features is not available for 12 weeks, and all of a sudden the decision process is disrupted with another decision based on whether or not you can or want to wait. Or you may receive negative opinions that make you question your decision. No one wants to make a mistake, especially when purchasing a big-ticket item like a car. The moment of truth arrives. The car comes in and you drive it off the lot. At this point, you are either satisfied or entering buyer's remorse. And here lies the ultimate question. How likely is it that you would recommend a Subaru to a friend or colleague? This is the base question for the Net Promoter Score, introduced by Fred Reichheld. The response to the question can be classified into 3 categories. You become a promoter, a passive, or a detractor. The Net Promoter Score is just one of many ways to measure customer satisfaction. Remember, the end goal of the process is to have the customer purchase the marketed product and to be satisfied with the decision to purchase the product or service you are marketing. If your product is going to be a success, you have to get to know your customer.
We go to some post-purchase behavior. So you can design a sales process that would map onto that buyer's journey if you're working in business to consumer sales. So like you're doing like financial services, this is, these kind of models that you've got from marketing are acceptable models, for like thinking about business to consumer sales and how you kind of move through that. And you are going to see more of these one-step simple sales processes in business to consumers than you would see in business to business selling. So I think of this as being uber simple for selling, figuring out like how to develop a process that impacts a buyer in a business to consumer setting is really more straightforward than it will be in the business to business setting. But hopefully this doesn't look that hard in terms of like how you could help people at each one of these stages, and you could design a sales process that would help them to recognize the problems they have, that might help them with the search, that might help them with the evaluation alternatives, that should help them with like making the purchase decision, and that would help them to lead to satisfaction post-purchase. So this is like buying a car, buying a house, for example. Sometimes this selling is different in terms of the relationship. So sometimes this type of selling can be transaction-based and transaction-focused. Like if you went to the store and you're trying to buy a mattress, like you probably aren't going to buy but one mattress, from that, wherever you buy the mattress. I can't recall, like, for example, where I last bought a mattress, but I'm fairly sure I'm not going back to the same place to buy another bed mattress. So buying a mattress can be very transactional in the way that's approached. Now, people might say we're going to try to be relational, and the seller's going to do that. But you're much more likely to see a sales process that's mapped onto something like this from someone selling mattresses or cars or even houses, right? Those kind of things. It's much more likely to see the sales process mapped onto this kind of a buying scenario. Okay, so hopefully you feel comfortable with how you could design a sales process that would fit what we do as consumers. You're exposed to them a lot, as you buy and interact. When we buy things from people, we're often interacting with retail sales. So in a department store, that's retail sales. So a lot of those jobs that I've talked about in the past, and some of the data from the Census Bureau that I shared earlier shows there are a lot of jobs in business to consumer sales. And those can be really good jobs in terms of like developing your people skills and developing your way of thinking about selling and developing an understanding of how you do these steps. So I want you to think beyond that in this class and try to think more about, or in this, at least in this video, think more about that and think about the business to business side of things, right? This slide is really designed to think, okay, once you're not thinking about the consumer, you're thinking more broadly about some of these other factors. This gets into some of those other factors that may be important in that sense. Okay, so this is a busy slide, but it really is just trying to organize some of the information that's associated with the consumer and different types of buyers on the left-hand side. The consumer, retail buyers, organizational buyers, government buyers, those kind of things. So the top one is what I'm referring to as B2C. The next three would all be what I'm referring to generically as business to business, although the government, people will call that business to government, but they're basically an organization. On the B side, I'm using that, at least at this point, fairly generically to talk about selling to organizations, one business selling to another business or another organization. So you can see that some of these different, examples for what is a retail buyer. So a retail buyer is what I'm often thinking about. You're selling for Procter & Gamble, you're selling to Walmart. That's $1 billion plus a year relationship that you're representing. So that's not like one person that sells that. In fact, just so you can understand the complexity of business to business, that's like somewhere around 500 people who sell for Procter & Gamble, who live in Bentonville, Arkansas, which is where Walmart is headquartered, and just work on a sales team that's just focused on selling to Walmart. So I'm going to use that Procter & Gamble and Walmart example a couple of times later in this video to give you some examples of the business to business side. But that's how that should give you an idea of how complex that business to business relationship and the selling processes can get on the B2B side. Okay, so organizational buyers. These oftentimes, where this is referring to organizational, some people might call these industrial buyers. Industrial buyers might buy auto parts or machinery or computers or those kind of things, right? Industrial buyers, in the sense of like they'll buy a product that they then use in the manufacturing for another product, right? So you might think of those as industrial buyers. This is referring to them as organizational buyers. An organization is just a group of people. So all these different groups are really retailers, or retail buyers, or organizations, and governments or organizations. So you could think about this one as being more what a lot of people refer to as industrial buyers. And then the third one is, or the fourth one is really institutional or government buyers. And the government will have a lot of regulation and ways in which you sell to them that makes them different as a buyer than maybe these other private industry buyers would be. And government regulations will often dictate how they can buy and what they can buy and how they do different things and how they have to approach procurement. In terms of the buying process, so if we're looking at an organizational buying process, you might have something where they start with this first part and they recognize the need that exists. From that need, they go to like gathering preliminary information. From gathering that preliminary information, they may determine like how are we going to make a decision. Once they kind of set out, these are the criteria that were used to make a decision. They may go to evaluating the alternatives in the fourth step, and saying, okay, here are the different choices that we might make. And then they're going to make and implement some decision. They, implement whatever that is. And then they're going to assess the performance, right? How did that work? And then they start all over again. So what I like about this slide is it does get into the idea that this is cyclical and ongoing. So this is much more like a relational process, that it doesn't end with start with recognize a need and end with assessment. It's continuing. And the reason I say that's important is because when you go from step 6 back to step 1, how well your solution performed in step 6 is going to be a major part of your success or failure when you come back to step 1. In other words, if you made a bad suggestion that didn't work for the buyer on the previous sales call, you've got to go back and own that bad suggestion or bad solution, and you've got to overcome the objections that previous recommendation had. So there is a sense of kind of building momentum from past good solutions that's going to help you to build a relationship. So you do want to make and propose good solutions that work for your buyer, because you're going to come back when you go from step 6 to step 1, and the buyer has another need that you might be able to address. You want to be coming at it from the perspective of having had proposed a good solution previously. So that's the idea that's kind of going on in terms of buying decision process. This is more general in terms of saying, okay, what are some of the buying context things? What are some of the things that, in terms of the context, that influence buyers when they're developing their solutions? So, extensiveness of choice set. How many different choices do they have? How much power does the buyer have? So you hear a lot of this kind of stuff in strategy terms. Buyer power is a big part, for example, of the Porter's model, Porter's 5 Forces model. If you study strategy as an MBA, you'll see that that's kind of an important component. How important is the purchase itself that the buyer is making? So they're like contextual things that are going to happen, that are going to impact the procurement process. But beyond the contextual things, there are also going to be these components of the vendor choice process that I'm going to try to bring back later. So I'll show you an example that kind of pulls these back in. And you can see procedural control is where you're trying to kind of limit influences that might take you away from an objective decision. Business buyers are often trying to develop these procedures or procurement processes that are highly rational. So it's harder for you to impact them through affect. So the procedural control are like efforts on the buyer's part to kind of prevent these external influences. There's a search for information that's going to follow some of that. So just like consumers search, businesses will search for information. They'll search for alternative solutions. And whether or not they have a proactive focus will be another component. So this is much more about, are they reactive kind of a process, or are they trying to be proactive in their procurement and thinking ahead of the problem that they might have? And those will lead to kind of a formal analysis. And this formal analysis then of the choice that is associated is really what's going to the deciders in the organization. So I'm going to talk about how business buyers will have multiple roles within the organizations, and these formal analysis then will be part of going to those deciders at that stage. So the buyers may be developing the formal analysis, the deciders are kind of using these formal analysis, but they'll often have processes that within their organization that tell that basically kind of lay out the criteria for how they're going to go about procurement. So this is kind of a study that looked across multiple organizations to develop what are some of the major steps and how do some of those major steps come into play in affecting the outcome of a procurement process. So this is a video that kind of expands upon that and goes into some of those details. So I'll let you watch this video, which is kind of a good overview of that procurement process.
You are watching Fab number 25 by Allison Tapp, Business Customers Procurement Processes and How Context Influences Them. Corporations have come to view procurement as a strategic level concern, and developing competitive advantage and organizational buying has become more sophisticated and professional. For B2B marketers, survival and success hinges on making effective judgments about how customers approach vendor selection decisions. It is constructive to recognize the breadth and diversity of vendor choice situations in practice and develop a basis from which to view alternative perspectives on buyer-seller exchanges. To improve our understanding of the procurement process, we need an integrative approach that considers the interrelationships among purchasing constructs that are important in both classic and contemporary views on organizational buying.
Buyer power!
Purchase importance is the buyer's assessment of the strategic significance of the purchase, reflecting not only the direct cost of a purchase, but also the impact of the purchase outcome on the buying firm's competitive advantage, strategy, and relationships with its own customers. The model shows a link for a hypothesized relationship between the purchase importance and buyer power. This direct relationship suggests that when the purchase is important to the organization, a clear incentive exists to work to increase buyer power. For procurement decisions with higher levels of purchase importance, there will be greater buyer power related to the purchasing process.
Purchase importance.
Purchase importance has direct negative impact on procedural control because less important buying decisions are delegated down to the organization. It may be programmed or automated. On the other hand, if the savings from automated decision-making is small relative to the total value of the purchase, or if there is a downside risk to applying standard procedures, there will be less reliance on procedural control. For example, when investments of assets are involved, management has fewer procedural controls on which to base decisions and will need to customize contractual safeguards.
Procedural control.
While purchase importance directly influences procedural control in turn has an impact on both the search for information and the extent of proactive focusing in the procurement process. It is conceptualized that the search for information as the purchaser's effort at scanning the internal and external business environment to identify or monitor issues relevant to the purchase decision. There is a widespread support from a number of different perspectives for the idea that purchase importance is positively related to the search for information. Purchase importance is a central aspect of decision risk, and the collection of additional information significantly reduces risk. Buying centers are larger and involve more communication for important purchases.
Search for information.
When there's greater procedural control related to the focal purchase, there will be less search for information for that particular buying decision.
Proactive focus.
Proactive focusing is the extent to which the purchasing, evaluation, and selection of a source of supply focus on long-range needs of the firm. A large portion of purchasing managers are strategically oriented, attesting to the relevance of this construct in a procurement context. Elaborate materials requirement planning systems and just-in-time production systems eliminate the need to consider and ponder the strategic issues for day-to-day purchases. When there is greater procedural control related to the focal purchase, there will be less proactive focusing.
Choiceness?
Powerful buyers are more likely to do formal analysis on a purchase decision because they can extract needed information, such as detailed cost data, from their suppliers. Procurement decisions characterized by higher levels of buyer power will involve greater effort at formal analysis for the focal purchase. While much recent research focuses on the relational aspects of buyer-seller arrangements, there has been tremendous growth in the number of purchase transactions that rely on some form of interactive e-commerce. Many firms are now expanding their decision criteria to include evaluation of value factors other than just price. There is a need for more work on the approaches to formal analysis that buyers use to quantify and evaluate this information. It is perhaps tempting to think of these e-commerce situations as completely different, but when viewed from the perspective of the process model here, it is yet another application of customers seeking more power and information to do a better job of making important purchases.
Okay, so as I just mentioned, there are a lot of times there are a number of different roles that people play within the organization. So this slide is trying to get at that, and this is from Salesforce Management. This is in a number of different sources where basically there are multiple roles that people in the buying organization play. So this is a listing of some of those types of roles that are pretty common across buyers. So you have initiators, are basically those people who kind of perceive there's a problem that the organization needs some solution for. You have users. Those will be people who, when the product is bought, they'll actually use the product. Influencers are people who may not be involved in the actual buying process, but they influence the outcomes of it. So these are people that the buyer or the buying committee or the buying team may talk to that has some influence on the outcome. Gatekeepers are basically some of those people who work heavily on like procedural control, as I talked about earlier. They're going to try to keep influencers who they don't want into the process out of the process. So you've often got to get through gatekeepers to get to an actual buyer or buying committee. The buyers are the people who are, basically contacting the selling organization, interacting with that, and placing the order. They're basically kind of the people who are kind of implementing the buying organization's decision. They're the agents for the buying organization. So that's who you're on the sales side. That's who you're going to deal with the most. Deciders are the people who have the final authority to make the decision. And then controllers, maybe things like financial folks who have, budgetary impacts that, says they can or can't spend this amount of money, those kind of things, right? So those would be like controllers. So these are like 6 different roles of people that might come into play, in the process. And I'm actually listing kind of on this side, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6. So I actually added controllers because controllers are, controllers could be considered like a subset of influencers, for example, right? And the controller could be someone who's different from the, different in that sense. But they could have like a strong influence if they're actually controlling the budget of what's being spent on the project. So you can kind of see these roles kind of differ in terms of like who's who and those kind of things. But that's basically a gist of like some of the different roles that people in the buying organization might play. And on the sales side, you're often trying to understand, well, who plays what role. So in account management, people will talk about account penetration. So in account penetration, you're trying to figure out how can we develop and deepen our relationship with the buying organization. And in doing that, you're often trying to identify who's playing which of these roles and how can you kind of improve your relationships with the people in each of those roles so that you have a stronger, deeper understanding of the buying organization and can co-create solutions that work even better for the buyer and the seller. Okay, so this is looking at like a persona, target persona. So target personas, you might break your personas out into each of these types of roles. So this is looking at the buyer. We know this is the buyer at XYZ Corporation, right? So XYZ Corporation's buyer is basically out there. His name is Kevin. So Kevin is basically the buyer. And Kevin is going to, these are some of the details when we do the persona. We might have things about them. There's not one set format for personas. So this is much like it is in marketing. You're just trying to develop an understanding of the people and what you know about those people to say, okay, this is the way a buyer might look. Okay, so personas and target markets are often kind of generalized. Within a particular account in a business-to-business environment, they're not just personas or generalized, but they're actually real people. Like, this could be, like Kevin could literally be your buyer. So in a persona world, Kevin is like an imaginary buyer who represents like all the different types of buyers that might exist. So when you're projecting forward and trying to do sales forecasting or sales planning, they're hypotheticals, but when you develop the relationship, they're real. Okay, so I hope that helps with thinking about personas and how personas can kind of help in developing your sales process. So this is Kevin. Kevin's going to be involved, as I talked earlier about some of the stages that are there. He's going to be involved in procedural control, proactive focus, and the formal analysis are kind of some of the major steps that might be important. So I might think about some of those stages that are associated with it in the buyer's journey and how I could, later on, as I understand the persona and what their roles are in terms of the stages of their involvement, then that's what helps me to kind of say, well, how do I develop a sales process that fits with that buyer's journey? So the buyer's journey is, when they're saying buyer's journey in a B2B sense, this is the buyer for the buying organization, which is XYZ Corporation. But the buying organization is going to have multiple players in it. So when we flush out more players, this is what I'm getting at in terms of roles. We've got this target persona. This is Christina, and Christina is basically a CRM specialist. So she's a user. She's basically going to use the product that you're going to buy. You're in this imaginary situation. You're selling a CRM system. CRM stands for Customer Relationship Management. So that's a product that helps organizations track their their relationships with sales organizations. So you could be selling anything here, but I'm just using a CRM, so you've got some familiarity and you're thinking some about that. So this could be Christina is going to be a person who's using the system. She's a CRM specialist. You can kind of see what her background is, and we know some different information about Christina. Again, this could be in this sense, could be a persona, or it could be a real person post closing it out. When we're thinking about the process, these are usually hypotheticals and hypothetical players in organizations that might be buying these. Okay, so here's our CEO. Our CEO is a decider, not surprisingly. So this might be in smaller firms. The CEO may get involved in these kind of decisions. The CEO may or may not be involved in a larger organization with something like what CRM system are we going to use that could be made at lower levels. I mean, the larger the organization, the more number of general managers that organization might have, and the decision-making authority of who has what is really what you're trying to decide as a sales organization. Where are these decisions being made, and who's actually the ultimate decider in this case? So in this scenario, our persona is of William, and William is basically the CEO at XYZ Corporation. In our terminology, he's the decider. So this is basically the person who in the end is going to decide which CRM system XYZ decides to buy. Okay, so if I'm going back to that earlier idea, what we're doing here is we're defining the steps in the sales process. We're trying to lay out the buyer's journey for your target persona. So I've talked some about them. We're then going to try to think holistically about it, think about how the salesperson can help, and then develop some clear exit criteria. So that's kind of what we would do after that step. So that was kind of the buyer journey and the target persona. So then we were trying to say, okay, how do we think holistically, and how do we kind of think about where the salesperson fits in? That's really the part where we're mapping on the sales process to the buyer's journey. So in doing that, we might start with something like this. This is just a suggestion, right? You start and you say, okay, let me just draft out and write down what steps is XYZ Corporation going to follow to make this decision. So this is an effort. This is a hypothetical again, right? So we're trying to say, okay, William, the CEO, is going to have a meeting with Kevin, and they're going to decide the firm needs to upgrade the system. That's kind of where it all got started. That's the impetus of this basically happening. Kevin shows the initiative and tells William he'll take the lead and explore the option to present William with a formal analysis the following month. So they'll often may have already set like a timeline for when they're trying to make their decision, and that would be nice to know this is when they're working against to make their decision if you're on the sales side. Kevin will, ask his assistant. Kevin has assistant John. John's basically a gatekeeper. He's going to contact the prospective sellers, of CRM systems and schedule appointments for them to pitch their products to him. Kevin is specific with which firms he wants to talk to, and he tells John, to decline any solicitation from others. That's the gatekeeper's role. So John is like shutting out anybody else who's selling CRM systems, except for the ones that Kevin talked about. And then Kevin decides, I want to get more insights from someone who's using the system. So he's going to meet with Christina, who I mentioned earlier is a CRM specialist. So he goes to Christina and he wants to know from her, like, what are some, what does she see in terms of best practices with CRM and the existing systems. And he wants to find out, what does Christina think about, how this should work. So Christina, in a way, is a user and an influencer. Right, so you can see how she's kind of got dual roles. She actually uses the system, but in this case, she's having a big influence on what Kevin's going to look for in the system itself. Kevin may also go out to other salespeople, right, to complete a formal analysis of the different options that are there, and then use that insight to develop his analysis and present his recommendations to William, again the CEO, who's going to decide which system the firm will buy. So this is just kind of doing a rough draft of what do I think the processes are, and then I can expand on that as I know different players or learn different things about the process. But if I draft it out like this, to me that works in terms of like helping me to figure out what do I want to do next. After I do that, what I'm going to do is I'm going to try to imagine now that so basically if I am the sales manager, what I want you to do is to take a second and think about it from what you know about the XYZ process and what I just spelled out in terms of like how they're going to go through it, how would you put together a sales process that fit with that? Hopefully it's not a total blank stare and that you've got some ideas, because that basically is what a sales manager does in terms of like designing a process. So that's what you're trying to get to, is like, how do I design this process? So by doing this homework that we've done, doing this background work and these background identifications and that process, it should be much easier to lay out, well, what's the sales process that fits with that buyer's journey. So what I want to do is I want to provide you, again, with the HubSpot training, you'll go through some of this and get a little better understanding of like how you might do some of this. What I want to do is give you an example. So this slide's really an example. This is an expanded example of how a sales process could be mapped onto a buyer's journey. So you can see at the top of this is like giving the stages of a buyer's journey. So this isn't the same one as XYZ necessarily, but you can see the buyer's journey is they've developed some awareness of a need. We've got a need that's there. They're going to investigate the options, so that does kind of fit. They're going to commit to some change, so they're going to say we actually are going to make a change. Then they're going to select a solution, like which one of these vendors or solutions do we want to do. They may do a validation step, so I didn't really, in my draft, I didn't have necessarily a validation step. Is this really going to work for me? And then they're going to make the purchase. So that would be the buyer's journey. And you can see those are the stages of the buyer's journey, but you can kind of see what are some of the questions, what are the buyer's needs as you go along that are outlined in the questions that coincide with the buyer's journey. So those are the buyer's needs that kind of represent those stages. So you can develop these maps inductively or deductively. So I want to make sure you understand what I mean by that. Deductively would mean I start with the stages, right, of the buyer's journey, and these are the stages, the ones across the top: awareness of need through purchase. And I'm going to then flush out what are the questions that are associated with it. If you're an inductive thinker, that works perfectly as well. You can start with like just saying, okay, what are some of the needs the buyer's going to have to make this decision? So if I went back and I tried to flush out my list that I started with earlier in the XYZ Corporation, and I started trying to form questions that are about, well, what are the buyer's needs at each one of these stages, then that would be an inductive way of coming up with the questions. And then what I would try to do is I would group those questions together and then form the stages after that. Right, so these are different ways of kind of mapping out the buyer's journey. But hopefully through this example, you can see the top half at this stage of how you would think about the buyer's journey. On the bottom half, this is where you're trying to map on the sales side. So on the sales side, I'm looking at kind of what the buyers do. And the buyers over here, I'm looking for buyers that have these needs. And what I want to do on the sales side is I want to get these high quality leads, right? I want to get the best leads that I can. So in the world of sales, the quality of leads has been key for a long time, right? So when I go back to like HubSpot's inbound selling methodology and the advantages of inbound selling is great for, or inbound marketing, it's great for like selling as well. If your contact comes through the web and they find you to begin with, that's actually kind of nice because they're already interested in talking to you, and that's kind of improving the quality of the leads. So that's one of the beauties of inbound selling or inbound marketing over traditional marketing. So you can think about these different sales activities and how can you get in front of the buyer. So that's one of the things that you're often thinking about is once you've got this lead and they've contacted your organization, they want to know more about it. They may, like your website may direct them to inquire about sales here. Well, that's your lead. So then how do you get in front of that buyer from that lead? That's often what you're trying to think about. The second thing is investigating options. How can you do different things? You can see these are different steps that you could do. You could do things that are still online. So if your lead came from an online, or even if it came from offline, or a different kind of a source, you're maybe focused on how can I educate them through online education, right? So online education might be a way that I can help. A third category in terms of sales process that might align to the committing to change is to think about how do I think about the desired outcomes that are there? And this is going to be a discovery process. So I'm going to go through this discovery process. And a discovery process can be part of a sales interaction. So a lot of times in professional selling, we'll talk about how do you go through discovery. So when I talked about a philosophy earlier that's often used, it's a very effective discovery process, that's spin selling, right? So you go to spin selling, this is where you're asking questions and you're trying to discover really kind of what is it the buyer's hoping to achieve in that process. So spin selling is a great discovery process that could fit into that stage where you're trying to look at committing to change and aligning the solutions. And then at spin, you've got to develop, you're often kind of looking towards a solution. So even if you're following a spin process, and you can integrate different components of some of the other philosophies where you're thinking holistically as you would in system savvy selling, you're going to try to propose some solution, or you're going to try to co-create the solution that's there. And then they're going to select it. So you're going to help them with that selection process, because you're actually helping them. If you're co-creating, you're helping them to develop the solution itself. So in co-creating, it should fit well. If you're listening well and they're engaged in the process, then their inputs are going to help you with co-creating that solution. From that co-created solution or that solution selection, they may do a process. This is what I said earlier about validating. They may go back and try to validate that this works. So again, if I go back to P&G, if we were buying a new technology product, we would often try that in a portion of the sales force as opposed to trying to roll it out and implement it across the entire global sales force. We would try like a portion, like maybe the northeast part of the United States. We would try the solution there to see if it worked or didn't work. And then we might make refinements and then try it again in the northeast if we thought that we needed another like trial round. But we test the product within the company before we implement it across the entire organization. And that's really what a validation step, that's an example of a validation step. And then you get to the solution or the purchase is where the buyer is kind of, using it across or purchasing it and implementing it, committing to the entire relationship. So these can be like multiple sales calls, as you can see, and multiple people who are involved in the process. So I encourage you to kind of think about it and think about how would you map these things out, and that will help you to get to the idea of how do you develop a sales process that meets the sophistication of the contemporary times. And it would be easier to teach like a simple sales thing. You go down to Best Buy and we figure out like how to do the Best Buy selling process and map that on. But I feel like as your professor, I'd be misleading you if I didn't at least help you understand that the procurement process in business to business is more complex than what might meet the eye to us as consumers. So, but understanding that complexity is an important part of managing salespeople who are in those different roles. And if you look at these, so a lot of you, when you first graduate from college, for example, will start in a sales role that's in one of these business-to-business organizations, business-to-business selling organizations. And you might, for example, start in a sales development role. Okay, so sales development will often focus on opening the sale or opening the relationship and initiating the relationships. Those sorts of things where you're trying to kind of get more. You're doing more of this qualification of prospects to move them along, to get them from being not being a customer to being a customer, and then you may hand that customer off to like field sales. So a lot of this development is also called inside sales. You're doing inside sales, so you may work at the corporate headquarters and you're selling. You're basically kind of trying to get these new customers into the fold. And then once they're into the fold, they go to the field sales and they work those customers. So a typical career might start with inside sales, then you might go to field sales. Field sales is where you're actually managing the process later as it goes through the commit, like in this the previous chart, committing to change, solution selection, those kind of things are maybe kind of more what field sales is responsible for, through to the purchase. And then, of course, there's going to be some post-purchase processes that would come into that as well. But when you get to the sales management side, you've often worked in either development or account management before you go into like sales management. And that gives you a pretty good feel of how the organization you're in works and how the buyers work. And that will help you to kind of be a better leader and a better sales manager as you go into those roles. Okay, so that's this is also part of why, if you recall some of the data from the Census Bureau on the pay that sales managers make, this is why it's a much higher number than what just a salesperson would typically make. So sales managers get paid big bucks because it's a complicated job. So hopefully that helps you with seeing some of that. This gets much simpler when you get in the field and you're actually doing it and working for an organization. Okay, so the steps that then would follow that after you got all that mapped out, using the CRM system, which I mentioned earlier, as a source of truth, continuing to service the customer afterwards, and then evaluating your process for improvements. Those are just 3 more steps that are all part of that whole designing of sales processes that deliver value. Okay, sales philosophies emphasize, or sales methodologies influence these sales processes, as I talked about earlier. They also influence the sales relationship. So that's another component of the Salesforce strategy. So the sales relationship is referring to the shared business and personal interests upon which mutual benefits are sought. So this is kind of the idea that we're looking at. And I emphasize both business and personal. A lot of times people think of sales for their personal side because the affect side and becoming a trusted advisor, those sorts of things are absolutely dependent on good, solid social skills and your development of those skills. But then there is the business side, so that analytical or that thinking side of you that helps you to kind of develop the best proposals that work well for your buyers is also an important component of the relationship. So you want to think about it in those ways. And much of what you've learned, if you're a marketing major, much of what you've learned in marketing is very relevant to what you would do in sales. So, I should have mentioned earlier, and I did mention at one point when I was talking about mattress sales and stuff like that, or automobile sales, these can be very much kind of transaction focused, and they may be characterized by really short-term thinking. Making the sale is really kind of what's most important, and you're really kind of just self-centered. So in transaction selling, if this was a professional selling class, again, I would talk about negotiations. And the way you approach a buyer in that kind of a negotiation is often in a competitive negotiation. This is rare for college graduates in sales jobs to be in transaction-focused sales roles. Where you're just focused on, I just want to get the most out of this one sale. So it's extremely rare. It's unlikely you're going to these kind of jobs. If you do, you are just trying to make that one-time sale. So you, as a consumer, you want to be aware that some of the salespeople you're interacting with in B2C settings are transaction-focused, and they're not kind of centered on the same sorts of things that we're talking about in class, in terms of I want to make sure this works well for the buyer. So in business to business, almost all these companies are now long-term focused because making one sale to one company of your product is typically not enough. You need to go back in order to sustain your business, have multiple sales. So you're thinking about the relationship. You do care that the solution works for the buyer. You are thinking more about the long term. You are thinking about the interaction between you and the seller. You want that to be collaborative. You want a productive relationship. And the type of negotiation, again, that you would do in this process would be more cooperative negotiation. So that's more consistent with the types of negotiation skills that you want if you're in a sales role. Is you want to have really strong cooperative negotiation skills and really strong collaborative negotiation skills, right? Because these are the types of sales roles that you're in. So when I think more about the relationship, what I want you to see is that the type of people are also like this. So when I talked about the interactive and interdependent nature of these components, relationships affect the types of people, and they'll affect the type of technology that comes into play, right? So the technology component is going to be different as we think about different relationships with people. So thinking about that interactive and interdependent nature of the 4 components becomes important as you're thinking about that. So for example, when you think about different types of people, one of the first thoughts that sales managers or salespeople sales organization might have is that there's really kind of 2 types of people, and you may have personality dispositions that fit better with one of these types of roles. These people are also like roles. The roles are like hunters. The roles are farmers. So hunters often open new relationships, and some people are just really good at opening new relationships, and so your fit may be really great with that. If when you first meet people, you're a smash, you're really good at that, like you're the life of the party. You can develop friendships very quickly. You're very adept at that sort of thing. That fits pretty well with the characteristics of what hunters do in these sales organizations. They often have very strong social skills. They're very persuasive. They are focused. They are ambitious. They are focused on the goal at hand, and they don't let one rejection or one no be the end of the world. So they have good buoyancy in terms of overcoming rejections. So this is kind of what hunters do, and they open these roles, maybe sales development roles or inside sales roles, hunters can like go from beginning to end depending on kind of what the organization is. So hunters can close. So I don't want to mislead you there, but oftentimes in a bigger organization, hunters will be focused on the initial part, finding new customers. And there's often this transition to farmers. So farmers, if you think about it, farmers like close, they harvest, they maintain, they expand relationships. So these are what account executives, account managers, field sales reps do. So this is more about long-term relationships. So like if you build relationships and you're really good at like maintaining those relationships on the personal side, that's important. But it's also important, so I talked about the relationship component of the business side. So you have to be building their business. So this is the customer business development philosophy. If you're also good at like building their business, this is going to help them to succeed long term, and it's going to strengthen the relationship between the buying organization and the selling organization. So farmers are really critical for like sustaining the business that they have with different customers. So those are two types of roles that you might think about in different people, and the different characteristics may fit better in one role versus the other role. Okay, so the way the relationship itself, in terms of the nature of the relationship in the old world was what was called the bow tie model. So the bow tie model of P&G and Walmart, which would have been, I think, probably in the 80s or so, maybe late 80s. It was a long time ago. The bow tie model was a long time ago, right? It was a long time ago in terms of when P&G and Walmart interacted. Through like a dyadic, everything goes through a salesperson on the P&G side, everything goes through a buyer on the Walmart side. And they adopted like the bow tie model. So the bow tie or the reverse bow tie model. So the reverse bow tie model, as you can see on the right, the idea is that there's multiple contacts across the team, right? So P&G has multiple people interacting with multiple people at Walmart. And some of those people, the graphics trying to show things like they have salespeople, they have logistics folks, they have IT specialists, they have other kinds of specialists who may represent, for example, different brands for Procter & Gamble. So these are people who are often like more, their core expertise is more marketing, possibly than it is sales. They're focused more on the brand side of the business. So you're going to have a number of these different functional specialists. Finance, that pile of money there is like finance specialists, because there's a lot of money when you're involved in a relationship like this. This is a $1 billion exchange annually. There's lots of like financial accounting issues that exist in terms of like who owes who what, and how does that money get paid, and how do you kind of track and trace the money trail. So these are different roles that would exist. And there's legal bonds and those kind of things that would exist across these companies, right? There's legal contracts that they'll enter and those kind of things. So there's a lot that goes into the relationship. This idea is like what creates some of those linkages is what this slide's getting at. Information linkages, operational linkages, cooperations, legal bonds, relationship-specific adaptations, all these different things that are associated with these different relationships, one being the supplier or the seller on the left-hand side of this slide, and on the right-hand side, the customer or the buyer being represented there, and the relationship basically being in the middle. So that's the idea of like some of the linkages that are created across these B2B relationships. So what I like to think about is I like to think about the relationships when I'm thinking about it from a sales management perspective. Is I like to think about, okay, there's a selling organization A and a buying organization B, right? And this is the buyer and the seller. And they can perform activities that are centered only on their firm's interests. They can just continue doing what the old world of selling was, which was an arm's length exchange, opportunistic behavior where we're just looking out for the seller. We don't really care about the buyer, and the buyer is just looking out for the buyer, and they don't really care about the seller. Okay, so in the new world, what people often think about is what's called vertical integration. So vertical integration is the extreme of that. Vertical integration is where a firm that manufactures products decides to buy the retail outlet. So they not only manufacture the product, but they also sell the retail outlet. So they can sell direct to consumers. So like the online model that started a lot of direct to consumer selling was Dell. The Dell model is like 40, 50 years ago, whenever the Dell model started online selling. But that was basically kind of one of the first sort of direct models. And people would kind of go on to Dell and they'd buy directly from Dell. So Dell owns the whole retail operation and the manufacturing operation in that scenario. So in that situation, that's like a vertically integrated entity. So if at one point there was a different retail side and Dell had decided to buy those retailers, let's say that Dell decided to buy Best Buy instead of just selling through Best Buy, and then they would own the Best Buy retail outlets and they would have like full control over it. Well, so a lot of manufacturers don't want to own the retail outlet because if you think about what retailers do, that's a different value function than what manufacturers do. So they may not be very good at retail. They may not have the core competencies or expertise that's required to do retail. So they might rather let Best Buy do that as opposed to thinking, well, let's buy Best Buy. So they might decide they want to sell through Best Buy. So this is an example of like where we're looking for these mutual interests, right? So what I think of is I think about these mutual interests that are there. How do we perform activities? The organizations, the sales organization and the buying organization is going to focus on what are our shared interests. What are we trying to accomplish? So customer business development is literally, the concept is literally focused on this space. So I refer to this as boundary blurring, and the decision is basically being a decision about how rigid the sales organization wants to make their boundary with the customer account, or how porous they want to make those boundaries. How much overlapping do they want to work with in terms of those boundaries? So there's a lot of porousness when you start sending like 500 people, for example, to Bentonville, Arkansas. That's a pretty porous boundary between Procter & Gamble and Walmart that would exist today. So that's an example of a pretty porous boundary. They might decide that they didn't want to be that overlapping with Walmart, or Walmart might decide they don't want that much overlap, and they might start doing more, making those boundaries more rigid. So that would be the idea of kind of focusing more on your self-interest as opposed to the shared interest of the two, and that would kind of develop in a different way. Okay, so this is why I'm saying a lot of the sales focus or the sales management focus is going to be focused on that. Do we make the boundaries with this particular account more blurred, as I was just talking about earlier, or do we make them more rigid? So that's a key strategic decision that firms make, that business selling firms make when they're thinking about business buying organizations. Okay, so if I go back now to the components of sales strategy, as I talked about earlier, these are interactive and interdependent. So where there are things that are happening in terms of the process and the people and the relationship and the technology, this all sort of interacts one to the next. So if I kind of expand on that, and I look now at the technology component, I want to talk a little bit about the technology component, and that's what this slide gets into. So this slide's saying, okay, technology and the technology tools that the sales organization has a lot to do with whether or not the sales organization can effectively build business relationships. So this research is one that argues about the importance of sales technology. So I'm going to, we'll talk more later. We'll have a session on technology, and so we'll talk more about this particular slide as we get into that material. But I'm just kind of introducing the idea that technology is another interface that you might overlay into this thinking if you're thinking more broadly about how do I put my sales strategy together. And you might think about how those technologies would come into play. And that would lead you to something that's more like, strategic account, this slide of strategic account management. So you're putting a lot of these things that we've talked about already together. We've talked some about this idea that relationships are important. We've talked about this idea that you've got multiple different players that represent a buying center. And then we've also talked about kind of technology plays a critical role. So those are some of the major building blocks that would help if you're doing like strategic account management. And that would help you to kind of think about how would you structure that strategic account. So as we get into things like the relationship and the structure, we'll talk more about how you would expand some of these different ideas. But what I hope is to this point, I've introduced some of the ideas and some of the components that are important in thinking about process and how you develop process, and then how that's going to impact other aspects of your sales strategy. So this has been an introduction to kind of thinking about process from a strategic perspective and seeing how sales processes can be developed, and then how the development of those processes will have impacts on the other components of an effective sales strategy. I hope you've enjoyed the presentation. I hope this makes sales processes make a lot more sense to you. This is Professor Hunter. Have a good day. This is Professor Hunter. Happy selling. I hope you enjoyed this. That's the end of this presentation. Hope you have a fantastic day.